The ice didn't crack beneath her boots so much as give way entirely, plunging Josie Kellerman's left leg knee-deep into the frozen marsh, while the rest of her fought to keep a 200-pound man from sliding face-first into the black water beneath the surface. His blood had turned the snow around them into something grotesque, a wide crimson smear stretching back 30 meters through the birch trees toward the burning wreckage of the boathouse. If she let go of his collar, he would drown in 12 centimeters of bog water. If she held on, whoever had put 2 bullets in him would follow the blood trail and finish what they started. Josie hauled him sideways, her shoulders screaming, and made her choice. 40 minutes earlier, she had been wiping down the bar inside the Santoro Estate's lakeside lodge, humming along to the country station, crackling from the ancient radio propped on the liquor shelf. The lodge sat on 600 acres of dense boreal forest on the northern shore of Lake Timiskaming, 3 hours from any town worth naming and accessible only by a single logging road that turned to soup every spring. It belonged to the Santoro family. The name didn't mean much to the average person in Ottawa or Toronto, but in the timber and mining corridors of northern Ontario, Santoro was spoken the way people spoke about weather, a force you planned around, never confronted. Josie didn't care about the family's reputation. She cared about the 1950s an hour she earned keeping the lodge presentable between the Don's quarterly visits, and she cared about the $67,000 in medical debt piling up at the Civic Hospital in Ottawa, where her younger sister Phoebe was tethered to a dialysis machine 3 days a week. Phoebe was 22, a former scholarship swimmer with a laugh that could fill a room, and her kidneys were failing faster than the specialists could explain. Every dollar Josie earned scrubbing imported stone countertops in the middle of nowhere went straight to keeping her sister breathing. It was the last Thursday of October. The first serious cold snap had arrived 2 days early, sheeting the lake in a thin, treacherous skin of ice and sending temperatures plummeting to -18. The estate manager, Mrs. Fenn, had sent the rest of the seasonal staff home before the roads froze solid. Josie had volunteered to stay behind and winterize the West Wing. Overtime meant another week of Phoebe's medication. She was alone in the lodge, or she was supposed to be. The gunshots came first, 2 sharp, unmistakable cracks that echoed off the frozen lake like snapping bones. Josie dropped the rag and killed the radio, her pulse slamming into her throat. She knew the sound. She'd grown up in Arnprior, an hour west of Ottawa, where her father had taken her hunting every November until he died. Those weren't hunting rifles. Those were handguns, close range, fired in quick succession. Then came the explosion. The boathouse, a cedar-shingled structure 200 meters down the shoreline, erupted in a ball of orange flame that lit up the frozen tree line like a second sunrise. The shockwave rattled the lodge windows. Josie stumbled backward, catching herself against the bar. Through the window, she watched the fire consume the boathouse, sparks spiraling into the black sky. And then she saw him, a figure staggering up the snow-covered slope from the shoreline, lurching between the birch trees like a wounded animal. He made it perhaps 50 meters before he collapsed, falling hard onto the frozen ground. He didn't get up. Every rational instinct told her to lock the doors, hide in the cellar, and wait for morning. This was the Santoro estate. Violence didn't visit places like this by accident. Whatever had happened at the boathouse was none of her business. But Josie was already pulling on her parka. She grabbed the emergency kit from behind the bar, a red nylon bag Mrs. Fenn kept stocked for the odd hunting accident, and ran out the back door into the biting cold. The air hit her lungs like shattered glass. She pulled her scarf up over her nose and sprinted toward the fallen figure, her boots punching through the crust of ice on the snow with every step. He was lying face down, dark hair matted with blood, an expensive wool overcoat soaked through and torn at the left shoulder. She dropped to her knees and rolled him over. Rafe Santoro. She had seen him exactly once, 6 weeks earlier, when he'd arrived by helicopter for a brief meeting with the estate's security chief. He was the Don's only son, tall, sharp-jawed, early 30s, carrying himself with the quiet arrogance of a man who had never been told no. Now his face was the color of candle wax. A bullet had torn through his left shoulder, and a second had punched into the right side of his abdomen, just above his hip. The stomach wound was pulsing dark blood in rhythmic spurts that terrified her. "Mr. Santoro." Josie pressed her fingers to his neck. His pulse was rapid and thread-thin. "Can you hear me?" His eyes cracked open. Unfocused, glazed with shock, he grabbed her wrist with a grip that didn't match his ruined body. "Gordon." He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Gordon set the charges. He's working for the Volkov outfit in Montreal. They want the northern mining claims. Gordon Ashworth, head of estate security for the past 15 years. Josie's stomach dropped. If Ashworth had turned, the entire property was compromised. The security cameras, the radio frequencies, the emergency landline in the manager's office, all of it ran through Ashworth's systems. I'm calling an ambulance, Josie said, unzipping the emergency kit. No. Rafe's hand closed tighter around her wrist. He's monitoring everything, every frequency, every signal. You call out, they triangulate this position and send a crew to finish it. The nearest OPP detachment is 90 minutes south, and half of them are on my father's payroll anyway. You'll bleed to death, then stop the bleeding. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that cut through the haze of pain. There's a trapper's cabin, 800 meters north, past the stone ridge. Old logging trail. Gordon doesn't know about it. My grandfather built it off the books in the 50s. His head dropped back against the frozen ground. Josie stared at the burning boathouse, then at the dark tree line. She could make it to the staff garage. Her truck, a battered 2009 Tacoma with bad brakes and a cracked windshield, was parked behind the maintenance shed. She could be on the logging road in 5 minutes, and if the road wasn't already a sheet of ice, she could reach the highway by midnight. She owed this man nothing. His family's world had produced the very violence that was bleeding out onto the snow in front of her. But she thought of Phoebe. She thought about what it felt like to sit in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, watching someone you loved slip away while you couldn't do a single useful thing. "Can you stand at all?" Josie asked. Getting Rafe Santoro to the trapper's cabin nearly killed them both. He was easily 6'2", dense with muscle, and barely conscious. Josie slung his right arm over her shoulders and hauled him upright, staggering under his weight. The cold was savage. It froze the tears on her cheeks before she could wipe them. The snow was calf-deep in places, and the logging trail was buried beneath a layer of ice that sent them both crashing down twice in the first 100 meters. She talked to keep him awake. She talked about anything, the radio station, the country song she'd been humming, the time Phoebe had convinced her to jump off the dock at their uncle's cottage, and she'd belly flopped so hard it left a bruise shaped like Australia. "You talk too much," Rafe slurred against her shoulder. "You weigh too much," Josie shot back, heaving him over a fallen pine. "So we're even? What's your name?" Josie. He repeated it like he was filing it away. "If we survive this, I'll double your salary. If we survive this, I'm handing in my resignation and moving to Vancouver." Behind them, headlights cut through the trees. The distant growl of an engine. A heavy vehicle, maybe two, moving up the main drive toward the lodge. Ashworth's people, they'd seen the fire. They were coming to confirm the kill. Josie moved faster. The cabin materialized out of the darkness like a ghost. It was small, rough-hewn logs chinked with ancient mortar, half swallowed by decades of undergrowth. The door was warped but unlocked. She shouldered it open and dragged Rafe inside, kicking it shut behind them. The interior smelled of mouse droppings and cold ash. She lowered him to the plank floor and ripped open the emergency kit, her hands shaking so badly she dropped the flashlight twice before she managed to click it on. The shoulder wound was ugly but manageable. A clean through and through that had missed the bone. The abdominal wound was the killer. Dark blood welled up with each heartbeat, soaking through his shirt and pooling on the dusty floorboards beneath him. If she didn't control it in the next few minutes, he was done. Josie had never finished nursing school. She'd completed 2 years at Algonquin College before Phoebe's diagnosis forced her to drop out and start working full-time. But she remembered the basics. Pressure, elevation, don't panic. She stripped off her scarf, folded it into a thick pad, and pressed it directly into the wound with both hands and all of her weight. Rafe's body jackknifed off the floor. A raw guttural scream tore out of him, echoing off the log walls. His hands flew up, grabbing her forearms, fingernails digging in hard enough to draw blood. "Stop fighting me," Josie ordered, pressing harder. "I didn't drag you 800 meters through the bush to watch you die on a dirty floor. It burns." His teeth were clenched so tight the muscles in his jaw twitched. "Good. That means you're still alive. Keep it that way." She held pressure for close to an hour. Her arms went numb, her shoulders seized. She counted his breaths to keep herself from screaming. Slowly, agonizingly, the bleeding slowed. She packed the wound with gauze from the kit, wrapped it tight, and did the same for the shoulder. Then she collapsed against the wall, shaking frozen, her parka soaked through with his blood and her own sweat. "Wood stove." Rafe's voice was barely a whisper. "Under the floor hatch. My grandfather kept supplies." She found it, a trapdoor beneath a moth-eaten rug in the corner. Inside was a cedar-lined cache containing wool blankets sealed in vacuum bags, a first aid kit far more comprehensive than the one she'd brought, a bottle of rye whiskey, waterproof matches, and a shortwave radio marked with a frequency, and the handwritten note, "Emergency only Enzo." She got the wood stove burning, wrapped Rafe in blankets, and took a long pull from the rye. The whiskey burned a trail of warmth down her chest. "Gordon's been planning this for months," Rafe said into the firelit silence. "He's been feeding the Volkov syndicate out of Montreal everything, shipping routes, mining survey data, my father's travel schedule." They want to take over the northern corridor. Killing me cripples the succession. Why are you telling me this? Josie asked. I'm a bartender. I wipe counters because you're the only person in 200 kilometers who isn't trying to kill me. He turned his head to look at her. The arrogance was gone. Stripped bare by pain and blood loss, he looked almost human, and because in my family a life debt is absolute. You saved me, Josie. That isn't something I forget. She closed her eyes, a sinking dread settling through her chest. She hadn't just saved a man. She had chained herself to a world she wanted no part of. Dawn came grey and silent, the cold deepening as the fire crackled in the stove. Josie changed his bandages, forced him to drink water, and watched the color slowly return to his face. He was going to live. The question was whether she would. The answer arrived at 7:14 in the morning, in the form of 3 black helicopters thundering over the tree line, the rotor wash sending snow swirling in violent white clouds across the frozen lake. Armored SUVs followed minutes later, crashing through the undergrowth from the logging road. Dozens of men in black tactical gear fanned out through the forest, rifles raised, German shepherds straining at their leads. At the center of it all walked Enzo Santoro. The Don was in his late 60s but moved with the controlled power of a much younger man. Silver hair cropped short, a heavy black overcoat that probably cost more than Josie's truck. His face was carved from granite, utterly devoid of warmth. He followed the blood trail straight to the cabin. Josie stepped out onto the sagging porch, hands raised, her blood-soaked parka open to show she was unarmed. A dozen red laser dots immediately danced across her chest. Enzo stopped 10 meters away. His dark eyes, so much like his son's but colder, emptier, swept over her, the blood on her clothes. Her chapped, raw hands. The hunting knife from the cabin she'd absently tucked into her belt. He didn't see a savior. He saw a problem. Who is she? Enzo asked his lieutenant without looking away from Josie. Seasonal staff, sir. Josie Kellerman. Bartender and general maintenance. She was the only one left on the property last night. Enzo was quiet for 3 seconds, then, she's seen too much. Handle it. The metallic click of safeties disengaging was the most terrifying sound Josie had ever heard. Sharper than the gunshots. More final. She didn't close her eyes. If she was going to die on a rotting porch after surviving the worst night of her life, she was going to look the man who ordered it right in the face. Stand them down. Rafe's voice was ragged, barely audible, but it carried the weight of a bloodline. He appeared in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, blanket draped over his shoulders, bandages visible beneath his torn shirt. He looked like death warmed over, but his eyes were locked on his father with an intensity that brooked no argument. She dragged me nearly a kilometer through a frozen bush in -18, Papa. She stopped 2 bullet wounds from killing me with a scarf and a first aid kit meant for fishing hooks. She doesn't die. She's a liability, Raphael. She's my liability. If you put a bullet in her, you put one in me first. The silence stretched. The dogs whined. Somewhere overhead, a raven called out across the frozen lake. Enzo gave a curt nod. The rifles lowered. The laser dots vanished. Get my son in the helicopter. Bring the girl. 20 minutes later, Josie was strapped into the leather interior of a Sikorsky, watching the Santoro estate shrink below her as the helicopter banked south. Medics worked on Rafe across from her, hanging blood bags and cutting away his ruined clothes. She looked down at the frozen expanse of Lake Timiskaming, the thin ice glinting in the pale morning light. She had survived the cold. But as she looked at the armed men surrounding her, she understood with perfect, terrible clarity that she hadn't been rescued. She had been collected. She woke in a room that smelled of starched linen and money. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Ottawa skyline, the canal, the copper rooftops of Parliament, the Gatineau Hills beyond. She was in a king-sized bed wearing silk pajamas she'd never seen before. An IV line was taped to her hand. Her right foot, which she'd gashed on a rock during the trek to the cabin, had been cleaned and stitched by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. Phoebe. The name came out before anything else. She ripped the IV free and swung her legs out of bed. Phoebe's next dialysis session was today. If Josie missed a shift, the payment plan. Miss Kellerman, I'd recommend staying seated. She spun. A man sat in the corner, maybe 30, wearing a dark suit and an expression that suggested he'd been born without the capacity for surprise. A tablet rested on his knee. My name is Soren. You're in a private medical suite in Rockcliffe Park. You've been sedated for 36 hours. My sister. I need to call my sister, Phoebe Kellerman. Age 22. Stage 4 renal failure. Dialysis 3 times weekly at the Ottawa Civic. Outstanding medical debt of $67,400. He recited it like a weather report. Before Josie could respond, the door opened. Enzo Santoro entered, his cane tapping a measured rhythm against the hardwood. We know everything about you, Miss Kellerman. We know you left Algonquin's nursing program to care for your sister. We know you work 2 jobs. We know the collection agency has been calling your apartment on Gladstone Avenue every Tuesday at 9 a.m. I saved your son, Josie said, her voice low and fierce. You owe me, and I always pay my debts. Enzo reached into his coat and set a thick envelope on the foot of the bed. Your sister's medical debt has been cleared. She has been transferred to the transplant program at Toronto General under the province's top nephrologist. Every cost covered. Josie stared at the envelope. It was everything she had worked herself to the bone for. Everything she had prayed for during those 3 a.m. shifts when the exhaustion was so thick she could barely see. What's the catch? The catch is that you no longer exist. Enzo gestured to Soren, who turned his tablet toward her. A CBC News article. The headline, Northern Ontario woman killed in single-vehicle crash on Highway 11. Below it, a photograph of her Tacoma, crumpled and burned beyond recognition against a rock cut. Your truck left the highway during the cold snap, Enzo explained, his voice clinical. Black ice. The fire made identification impossible. Dental record confirmed the remains. You faked my death, Josie's voice cracked. She's all I have. Phoebe is all I have, and she is alive because the world believes you are dead. Rafe appeared in the doorway, moving stiffly but upright. He wore dark clothes, bandages visible at his collar. He looked at his father, then at Josie. Gordon accessed the estate security logs before he disappeared. He knows a bartender named Josie Kellerman was the only staff member on the property that night. He knows you pulled me out. If you go back to your apartment, his people will come for you, and when they're done, they'll go after Phoebe to eliminate the loose end. Josie sank onto the mattress. The walls of the room, expensive, beautiful walls, felt like they were closing in. Until Gordon Ashworth is found and eliminated, Rafe continued. You stay here, you cannot leave. You cannot contact your sister. It's the only way to keep her safe. And how long does that take? As long as it takes. The cage was exquisite. 4,000 square feet of polished walnut, Italian marble, and bulletproof glass. Soren ensured she had everything. Books, clothes, food delivered from restaurants she could never have afforded. He also ensured she never reached the elevator. The biometric lock responded to exactly 3 palm prints, and hers wasn't among them. Her only connection to the outside world was a tablet Soren placed on the kitchen island during the 2nd week. It ran a single application, a secure encrypted video feed from Phoebe's room at Toronto General. Josie sat on the leather sofa for hours, knees drawn to her chest, watching her sister sleep. Phoebe looked better. The grayish tinge beneath her eyes was fading. The Santoros had kept their word. But watching Phoebe cry over the news of Josie's death, watching her sister hold a photograph and shake with grief while a nurse rubbed her back, broke something inside Josie that she wasn't sure could be repaired. 5 weeks passed. Rafe visited every few nights, usually late, smelling of cold air and whiskey, and something metallic she'd learned not to ask about. The dynamic between them was unstable. Captor and captive, debtor and creditor, 2 people bound by blood spilled on frozen ground. You're watching the canal again, Rafe said one night, dropping a leather folder on the glass table. He loosened his tie, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. I'm watching people walk home from dinner, Josie replied without turning. Normal people, doing normal things, while I sit here like a museum exhibit. Phoebe asked her nurse today if she could visit your grave when she's strong enough to travel, Josie added quietly. Do you have any idea what that's like? Watching the person you love most in the world grieve for you while you eat takeout from Bector. Rafe's jaw tightened. It keeps her alive. Then find Gordon and end this. You promised me this was temporary. He's a ghost, Josie. He built our security systems. He knows every safe house, every front company, every contact in the OPP we've ever cultivated. The Volkov Syndicate is bankrolling his disappearance. Until he makes a mistake, he already made one. Josie turned from the window, her eyes sharp. Gordon's quarters in the East Cottage. I cleaned them every 2 weeks. My people tore that cottage apart the morning after the fire. It was immaculate. Your people don't know how to clean. Josie stepped toward him. Gordon had an antique gun cabinet in his office. Floor model, glass-fronted cherry wood. But he never kept firearms in it. I asked Mrs. Fenn about it once. She said it was decorative. But the weight was wrong, Rafe. I moved it to vacuum behind it, and it barely shifted even though it was supposed to be empty, and the humidity gauge on the side. It's a fake. The needle hasn't moved once in 6 months. Rafe went very still. The exhaustion vanished. In its place was the cold, calculating focus she'd seen in his eyes during the worst moments in the cabin. A concealed safe, he said. Off-network. If he was brokering a deal with the Volkovs, he wouldn't trust digital storage. He'd keep physical records close. He was already pulling out his phone. Soren, prep a team. We're going back to Timiskaming. He looked at Josie. You just found our ghost. Wait. She caught his arm. When he's dead. When this is over, I walk out that elevator door and you let me go. You never come looking for me. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that looked, for a fraction of a second, like grief. Then you have my word. The safe held everything. Beneath a false bottom, Rafe's people found an encrypted hard drive and a handwritten ledger documenting 18 months of payments from the Volkov syndicate. The encryption took less than a day to crack. Gordon Ashworth wasn't hiding in a compound. He was operating out of a decommissioned grain terminal on Montreal's waterfront, using the industrial noise and cargo traffic to mask his movements. The raid was set for 2 a.m. Josie refused to stay behind. She'd threatened to put a chair through every window in the suite until the Ottawa police showed up. She needed to see it end. She needed to know the cage door was opening. Rafe placed her in the armored command vehicle, 3 blocks from the terminal. She sat in front of glowing monitors, wearing a Kevlar vest over a black sweater, a headset strapped to her ears. Soren sat beside her, a suppressed handgun resting on his thigh. Over the radio, Josie listened to the precise, terrifying choreography of a syndicate operation. Perimeter secure. Breaching main structure. For 8 minutes, it was controlled. Muffled shots, terse radio confirmations. Then chaos. Second floor! It's a setup, they were waiting for us! Automatic gunfire erupted through the speakers. Josie's hands gripped the edge of the console. Rafe! She shouted into the mic. Rafe, do you copy? Static. Then a ragged breath. Copy. Pinned down in the loading corridor, they had the building wired. Josie's eyes swept the thermal monitors. Soren had hacked the terminal's ancient security cameras minutes before the raid. Through the grainy green-tinted footage, she saw the firefight raging on the second floor. And she saw something else. A single thermal signature moving away from the combat, slipping down an exterior staircase toward the waterfront, heading for a rigid hull inflatable boat tethered to the pier. Soren. Look, she pointed. Soren leaned in. That's Ashworth. He's running. He keyed the radio. Boss, target fleeing east side, heading for the docks. I can't break through, Rafe growled over the sound of gunfire. If he hits the river, he's gone, Josie didn't think. She slammed the door release and threw herself out of the vehicle into the frozen Montreal night. Josie. No. She was already running. Her boots hammered the icy pavement. She cut between stacked shipping containers, the sound of the firefight echoing off corrugated steel. She burst onto the wooden pier just as Gordon Ashworth reached the end of it. He was tall, gaunt, grey-haired, a heavy duffel over one shoulder. He tossed the bag into the inflatable and turned to untie the mooring line. Gordon! He whipped around, drawing a pistol with practiced speed. He aimed at her chest and Josie skidded to a halt, her breath coming in ragged white clouds. Recognition crossed his genuine shock. You. His voice was flat with disbelief. The bartender. Enzo told the families you burned on Highway 11. He lied. Josie stepped forward, the fear drowned by a fury so clean it felt almost peaceful. And because of you, my sister thinks I'm dead. Because of you, I've spent 5 weeks locked in a tower watching her cry through a screen. Gordon let out a short, harsh laugh. Brave girl, but you're unarmed. What exactly is your plan here? Josie reached into her pocket and pulled out the radio Rafe had given her in the penthouse, a replacement for the one she'd dropped in the lodge the night everything changed. She held it up and pressed the transmit button. I'm not the plan, she said. I'm the distraction. Gordon's face went white. He spun toward the shadows behind the containers. Rafe Santoro stepped out from behind a rusted forklift, rifle raised, laser sight steady on Gordon's chest. He was covered in concrete dust and blood, none of it his own, and his eyes held the absolute, unhesitating focus of a man settling a debt. It's over, Gordon. Ashworth looked from Rafe to Josie, understanding flooding his face. He'd been outmaneuvered by a syndicate heir and the woman who cleaned his quarters. With a snarl, he swung his pistol toward Josie. He never fired. 2 suppressed rounds hit him center mass. The force threw him backward off the pier. He hit the black water of the St. Lawrence with a heavy splash, and the current pulled him under in seconds. Silence. Just the lap of water against the pilings and the distant wail of Sûreté du Québec sirens. Josie stood perfectly still, staring at the dark river. It was over. The man who had stolen her life was gone. The debt was paid. Rafe walked down the pier until he stood in front of her. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb catching a tear she hadn't felt fall. You shouldn't have come out here. He could have killed you. I needed to make sure you kept your promise. Rafe held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached into his vest and pulled out a thick envelope. SIN card. A bank account with enough to buy a house somewhere quiet. Phoebe is being discharged next week. A private car will take her wherever she wants to go. He paused. You're free, Josie Kellerman. Josie took the envelope. It was heavy. Inside was everything she had fought for. Safety, freedom, a life where she never had to look over her shoulder or scrub another counter. She could disappear into a quiet neighborhood in Victoria or Halifax, pick up her nursing degree, rebuild everything from scratch. She looked at Rafe. She saw the darkness in him, the violence that would always be part of his world, the blood that would stain his hands long after the wounds healed. But she also saw the man who had protected her sister, the man who had kept every promise, the man whose heartbeat she had counted through the longest night of her life on the floor of a freezing cabin in the middle of nowhere. Josie looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the river. Slowly, deliberately, she tore it in half and let the pieces flutter into the dark water below. Rafe's eyes widened. "What are you doing? That's your way out." "I know." Josie stepped closer, the distance between them vanishing. "But I'm done being a ghost. And I'm done being staff." She held his gaze, steady and unafraid. "I dragged you out of the snow, Rafe Santoro. I kept you breathing with a scarf and a first aid kit. Your life belongs to me now. And I'm not the kind of woman who walks away from what's hers." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Rafe's face, half admiration, half warning. "You have no idea what you're getting into." "Try me," Josie whispered. The cold snap that had nearly killed them both on the shore of Lake Timiskaming hadn't destroyed Josie Kellerman. It had burned away every version of herself that had ever accepted less than she deserved. She had entered the Santoro world as invisible labor, a woman who wiped counters and said nothing. She walked out of it as something else entirely. Not a captive, not a witness, not a ghost. She was the woman who had decided, on a frozen pier in Montreal with sirens closing in and gunpowder still hanging in the air, that she would never be invisible again.